All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Best Published Resources for Colonial New England Research. My name is Kathleen McKenzie, Education and Programming Manager here at American Ancestors, and I will be moderating today's session. This program is brought to you by the Brew Family Learning Center. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We provide resources and expertise in nearly all aspects of family history, and we're pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Our presenter today is Robert Battle. Robert is the editor of the New England Historical and Genealogical Register, the nation's premier genealogical journal. He is responsible for selecting, arranging, and editing the articles appearing in each issue, reviewing submitted books, and working to keep the quarterly schedule on track. Once each issue's editing has been completed, Robert then works with other members of the publishing team to lay out the final version before it goes to print. He serves as the point of contact for the register with the public and within the American Ancestors organization. On the public-facing side, he receives all article submissions and books for review, determines the suitability of those submissions for the register, and works with the authors of the articles in the editing process. He also fields inquiries and other communications about the register from American Ancestors staff. Robert earned an MA in linguistics at the University of Washington in Seattle. He served as an instructor there and later at Western Reformed Seminary in Tacoma and Puyallup, Washington, before signing on as the Register's 27th director since its 1847 inception. Robert is the author of several dozen articles appearing in the Register and other genealogical journals. He was elected a Fellow of the American Society of Genealogists in 2021. So when it comes to colonial New England research, there is a gold mine of published resources to explore. As a group, early New Englanders are perhaps some of the most studied people on the planet. Across centuries and decades, historians and genealogists have created compiled genealogies, record transcriptions, finding aids, and study projects detailing early New Englanders' identities, lives, and family histories. In this online lecture today, Robert will discuss essential published resources for colonial research in the region. At any point during today's presentation, please feel free to go ahead and type your questions into the Q&A panel found at the bottom of your screen. We'll address as many as we can at the end. There is also an optional syllabus available for purchase to accompany this webinar if you are interested. I'll put that in the chat, and it will also be in the follow-up email later on as well. Your purchase helps support us in making these free webinars. This presentation is also being recorded for later viewing on our website and our YouTube channel. So if you missed something on today's first listen, don't worry, you can always go back and review the presentation later. All right, so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Robert.
Thank you, Kathleen. As Kathleen's mentioned, the people who lived in colonial New England are possibly the most studied and best documented group of people in history, especially if you exclude from consideration people like royalty and politicians. American Ancestors, originally known as the New England Historic Genealogical Society, is the oldest genealogical society in the U.S. We were founded in 1845, 180 years ago this year, and one of the purposes for which we were founded was to promote the publication of high-quality genealogical scholarship about New Englanders. We started doing this in earnest in 1847 when we began publishing our quarterly journal, the New England Historical and Genealogical Register, more commonly known as the Register, of which I am particularly fond, of course. We have been publishing that journal ever since. In fact, the spring issue of volume 179 just went to press and should be showing up on the website soon. Our society has also published many hundreds of books over the years, and many thousands of additional books and journals have been published over those years by others as well, from transcriptions of vital records to compiled genealogies of New England families. This, combined with better than average survival of documents from the past, makes New England a fantastic place to research, whether you're an expert or just an enthusiastic amateur. Our focus in this course is not on those original documents, however, but on what is available in print today, whether in paper form or on your computer screen. Even if it's your intention to explore those original documents, it's still vitally important to know what has already appeared in print. You don't want to reinvent the wheel, and it's important to acknowledge what has already appeared in print about the person or people you're working on, and whether you are correcting that previous work, confirming it, or adding to it. Published works can also make it much easier to find the original documents that would be the most helpful for your search. So as you saw in the last slide, I've divided this presentation up into 5 main categories of published resources. And given my seminarian background, of course, I had to make them alliterative. So they're places, people, populations, that is, people in particular places, periodicals, and primary documents. We'll start with places. So first, we're going to look at some essential published sources dealing with places. Knowing where your ancestor lived is of vital importance. You need to know where each town was geographically, what other towns it is next to, what bodies of water are nearby, what physical challenges or opportunities were present, and so forth. You also need to know where each town was politically. And by that, I don't mean whether it was a red town or a blue town, but what governmental connections it had with other places. Which county was the town in, and which colony? At which governmental level were different types of records kept? Was the neighboring town where your ancestor likely also left records in a different county or colony, making it necessary to check for records in very different places in spite of being geographically close? Finally, you need to know the history of each place. When was it founded and by which people? Where did they generally come from? And where did they generally go when they left? There are many good reasons for answering these, or resources, I should say, for answering these questions. Today, we're just going to look at 3 of them. So the first of these is the Genealogist's Handbook for New England Research by Rhonda McClure, now in its 6th edition, published in 2022. This is one of the few books that rates a position on the shelf next to my desk within seated reach, as I am always pulling it down to check things. The book has a relatively brief section at the beginning about New England as a whole, and then moves on to the main portion. In that main portion, each of New England's 6 states begins with the state profile, with a map of the state and its surroundings, and sections dealing with locations of various records kept on the state level. Next, there is a section of county maps for each state. Each county, arranged alphabetically within each state, has 2 maps showing the county's location in the state and the town's locations within the county. Finally, for each state, there is a list of the cities, towns, and plantations in that state, with information for each about when and how it was formed or dissolved, which county it is in, and for Connecticut towns, which probate district it is in. So on the next slide here we have an example on the left of a page from the state profile for Maine, showing a list of the county offices and their contact information. So they have these for all the different states. It's just an example of it. On the right is a page from the list of cities, towns, and plantations for Maine, showing the types of information available here. So for example, if we look at the town of Deerhide, or Deer Isle, I should say, we see that it was settled in 1762, but incorporated in 1789. I don't know if you can read it on your screen there. And that the towns of Islehoe and Stonington were carved out of its original footprint in whole or in part. We also see that it is in Hancock County, that town records for it survive from 1789 through 1853, that vital records survive from 1768 on, and that those vital records have been published in book form. And in the little last, or the second last column there, that little P, that's what that means, that the vital records have been published. It's worth pointing out that the brown ME tab on the side of the cities, towns, and plantations page there, every page actually has that tab on it on the side facing the outside of the book, which makes, it's color coded by the state and arranged by height depending on the type of section. So it makes it easy to find each section in the book without even opening it up, just finding it on the edge. All right, next slide. Here we have the county maps for Lincoln County, Maine. So as you can see, there's a map showing the county and its context in the state as a whole, and a map showing the town divisions within that county. I find this particularly useful for seeing which towns are next to each other, even across county or state lines. Unfortunately, the book is available only in printed form now and not online. By contrast, the next resource we'll be looking at is only online, though drawn in part from book sources. This is the town guides. One of the great resources that American Ancestors offers online is their set of town guides, which are arranged by state. They have town guides for all of the New England states as well as for New York. On this slide, we only have the Connecticut and Maine guides showing, but if you scroll down on that website, on that web page, you'll see the guides from Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New York, Rhode Island, and Vermont. So I want to see what this has to say about the town of Lynn, Massachusetts. So first, I'm going to click on the Massachusetts Town Guide down below, which will bring up the screen that has all the towns listed alphabetically. So scroll down to Lynn here. As you can see, for Lynn, they have a town profile, information as to when it was established in 1635, and in which county, Essex, plus links to American Ancestors databases for related vital records and probate records. So what we want to look at right now is the town profile. So we'll click on that, which brings up this screen, which links to a database drawn, in this case, from a published work on the towns in Massachusetts. So we go ahead and click on the View Image page. You get the next slide. So for Lynn, what we have in this section is a chronology of the main events in its founding and development, plus information about other names that have been used to describe it or places within it. So we're going to briefly compare what is presented here with the information given about the development of Lynn in the next published resource. That next published resource is the Great Migration Newsletter. This was published by Robert Charles Anderson as part of American Ancestors' Great Migration Study Project from 1990 through 2016 in 25 volumes. One of its features was a Focus On section in which Anderson discussed the colonial history of various New England towns and larger areas. In the syllabus for the course, I have listed these various places covered in these sections and where they can be found. The section, the Focus on the town of Lynn, is one of the first places that Anderson focused on pages 19 through 22 of volume 1. So we'll take a look at what that has there. So this is the first page of those 4 pages covering the settlement and history of Lynn. So you can notice right off, there's a lot more detail than was given in the town history of Lynn from that last resource. So here he talks about the progress of settlement of Lynn, social composition, taxes. On the next page, with this Focus on Lynn, we have the history of the church at Lynn, by the alternative name of Saugus, which is one of the original names for Lynn. But that's all laid out there. On the third page, Anderson describes the challenges that exist for determining early land ownership in Lynn due to the poor survival of early records. All of the original land records were lost, so the land ownership has to be reconstructed from other sources. So he talks about that here. And then on the 4th page of the Focus on Lynn, Anderson describes the sorts of records that have survived that can help us shed light on the time period for which the contemporaneous records have been lost. So very sadly, just a couple of months ago, Robert Charles Anderson passed away, taking with him his deep knowledge of and insights into early New England history and settlement. But fortunately, we have access to much of that in his writings, such as these focuses on particular places in the Great Migration Newsletter. Okay, so much for published resources about places. Now let's move on to looking for people. So the first section here is finding aids. So when you're looking for a particular colonial ancestor, one of the first places to check are these published finding aids. All of these are chiefly intended to direct the researcher to other published works. So in most cases, they should not be cited as sources in your work. All right, the first of these, the most important of these finding aids, is the Great Migration Directory by Robert Charles Anderson, which was published in 2015. In this book, every known immigrant to New England by 1940 is listed, or at least the head of household, because if a man or woman came over with their children, usually only that man or woman would be the one listed here. Um, However, siblings are listed when they didn't come over with a parent. So in this example, you see several Lawrence siblings. They'll count as the first generation because, like I said, their father and mother did not come with them. You have, let's see, John Lawrence from St. Albans, Hertfordshire, Mary Lawrence's sister, Thomas Lawrence, their brother, and William Lawrence, their brother, all on this page here. For each such person, their European, usually English origin is listed if known, then the year in which they came over, or at least first known to have come over, plus the name of the ship they were on, if that's known, and then where in New England they lived. That's followed by the sources, usually published, in which are consulted to derive all that information that I just listed, plus any authoritative published works on that particular immigrant and his or her family that Anderson found to be the most valuable. Generally speaking, if that immigrant was treated in one of the Great Migration Study Project studies, which we'll get to shortly, that is the only work cited because all the other sources are already cited there. When Robert Charles Anderson passed away, he had nearly completed an updated version of this Great Migration Directory. So hopefully either this year or next, we will be publishing that. But in the meantime, as it is, this is a great resource. All right, the next finding aid to consult is Martin Hallock's New Englanders in the 1600s. Because this was published a few years before the Great Migration Directory, the chief use of this book is to check for New Englanders who came over after 1640 or who were at least not known to have arrived by then. Hallock made a thorough check of the periodicals and best genealogies published between 1980 and 2010 for major references to early New Englanders. As you can see in each listing here, there's no mention made of when each of them immigrated, but rather when and where they were born or died. So, for example, we have William Douglas, who was born about 1610, died in New London, Connecticut in 1682. Then he has three different works there, the last of which he specifies is dealing with the English origin of his wife. So, like I said, that's mainly useful for those immigrants who came over after 1640. All right, the next finding aid is Meredith Colquette's Founders of New England Families. This book is chiefly useful for pointers to materials published before 1980, when Hallock's work takes up. As you can see, there is a bit more biographical information presented for each person, a mixture of what Anderson and Hallock included. So, for example, for Edward Culver, to see where he lived, came to Boston by 1630, moved to Dedham by 1637, Roxbury by 1646, New London by 1653, died there in 1685, has his occupation, and then a main published source to check for him. Also, while the majority of the entries in this book are for New England immigrants, including all the entries on this page that we're looking at here, the entire Atlantic seaboard is included. So you have quite a few people who don't fit in the New England colonies. All right, the last finding we're going to look at today covers works published before 1962. This is Clarence Almond Torrey's Index of New England Marriages prior to 1700. From 1927 to his death in 1962, Torrey went through thousands of published works and extracted all of the marriages of New Englanders claimed in those works to have occurred on or before 1699. This was originally a large handwritten manuscript kept in the reading room of an American Ancestors Boston headquarters, first as the original manuscript for people to look at, and then accessible only as microfilm copies in order to preserve the original from further wear and tear. In 1985, a version of it was published, which unfortunately contained just the marriages and none of the sources cited. In 2001, we published a more complete version with the sources as a CD-ROM, and then later as an online database. Because of what it is, which is a largely uncritical accumulation of marriage data from thousands of mostly secondary sources, this should definitely not be cited as a source. However, It is invaluable as a guide to where thousands of early New Englanders were mentioned in those thousands of mostly secondary sources. So those are the main findings to check when you're looking for somebody. First, the Great Migration Directory for earlier immigrants, then Hollick, Colquette, and Torrey for the later ones. All right, so let's move on to study projects for people. The works in this category provide overviews of what is known about particular individuals and their family connections at the time of publication. So it's kind of a state of the art or art of the state. Anyway, the information that is known about each person at the time it was published. Most of these come from the Great Migration Study Project, which began in 1988. The ultimate goal of American Ancestors Great Migration Study Project is to produce genealogical and biographical sketches of all of the people covered in the Great Migration Directory. That is, everyone who immigrated to New England by 1640. This was started in 1988 with Robert Charles Anderson as at the helm. Before he passed away earlier this year, he chose Nathan Murphy to be his successor in spearheading the project. So, starting in February of 2025, he has been the person in charge of getting these things published. So far, there have been 16 volumes published, with many more planned. We'll get that into a bit later. As mentioned before, a newsletter was also published from 1990 to 2016 in 25 volumes rather, available both in print form and as an online database on American Ancestors. The project has also hosted several tours and other programs over the years. It's always been one of my regrets that I wasn't able to go on one of those with Bob when he was still doing them. All right. So the published volumes, the 16 of them to date, arranged in order of coverage rather than order of publication, or actually a mixture of both. Puritan Pedigrees describes the English background of the Great Migration, and it shows the deep roots that it had in the various ministerial companies and so forth. The Great Migration Directory, which you mentioned. The first series, The Great Migration Begins, Immigrants to New England from 1620 to 1633, which is a 3-volume set, followed by the second series, The Great Migration, Immigrants to New England from 1634 to 1635, which is a 7-volume set. This began the third series earlier this year or last year, with The Great Migration, Immigrants to New England from 1636 to 1638. Like I said, 1 volume to date. The second volume, which is written by Nathan Murphy, should be coming out sometime either at the end of this year or more next year. We've also had the Pilgrim Migration, Immigrants to Plymouth Colony from 1620 to 1633. The Winthrop Fleet, Massachusetts Bay Company Immigrants to New England from 1629 to 1630. The Mayflower Migration, Immigrants to Plymouth in 1620. And like I said, the Great Migration Newsletter. So let's see. So the plan is, after the third series is published, to go on to a fourth and final series with the immigrants from 1639 to 1640. And Robert Charles Anderson's plan also was to update that first series from 1620 to 1630 by superseding them with newer volumes covering the same set of immigrants. So this has been partially done to date with the Pilgrim Migration and the Winthrop Fleet, which have also already been published, with further volumes planned on immigrants from East Anglia and from the West Country of England. So hopefully at some point those will be finished as well. So this particular study project covers from 1620 to 1640, and people might wonder why this particular time period is covered, although no one who has seen any of Bob Anderson's own public or presentations already know the answer to this. But basically the reason is that it only goes to 1640 is that immigration to New England fell off quite a bit that year. As seen in this chart here, the English migration to New England began in 1620 with the Mayflower passengers, continuing at a low level until the period from 1629 through 1631, which is marked mainly by the immigration of the Winthrop Fleet. And then when the persecution of Puritans and others opposed to the established Church of England peaked in the period from the early 1630s through 1640 is when that immigration also peaked to about 2,500 a year. Things began looking up for the Puritans in England with the convening of the Long Parliament in 1640, which caused the pressure to drop off quite a bit, which resulted in quite a lower amount of people coming over for religious reasons. So it was determined to make that the point that was limited for the project here. All right, so for each sketch, in whichever book it appears, the information included for that person is their origin, migration, the year and ship, the first place of residence, the removes, in other words, where they went in New England after their first place that they settled, the return trips, if any. So if they went back to England, list that. Person's occupation, their church membership, like whether they were a member or not, and when they became a member, whether they were a freeman or not, and at what time they became a freeman, level of education. Sometimes this is known from university degrees, but more often it's inferred by the level of literacy we can see by what they wrote or whether they had books in their estate, things like that. The offices held, their estate, whether that was intestate or with a will, that's mentioned there. Then their vital records, their birth record, death record, marriage record, their children, the associations, that is like the people that were related to them who also came over, or other important connections that were evidenced throughout their lives. And then comments, things that don't fit any of the other categories, and bibliographic notes. So what other works have had information that is important to look at about that person or people. One thing I skipped over in this list was the previous residences. They're in the square brackets. This is something that has been added starting with the most recent series, and I think it's a good thing to add. And what that is places lived in England or Europe before that place of origin. Now, the origin is essentially the last known place in Europe they were known to live before they came over, which in many cases is the same as where they were probably born, where their family came from. But in several cases that we know of, that just happened to be the last place that they left a record in before they came over, and that wasn't really where they were from at all. So for example, if someone was from a little town in Suffolk, and then they journeyed to London, and from there to New England, London would be the origin, but really their previous residences would be more indicative of where their family came from. So that's a positive addition to what's been added to each person starting with this new series. All right, so let's look at an example here from the second series, entry for John Astwood. So we can see like those different categories I mentioned. He came from Little Haddam in Hertfordshire. He came over in 1635 on the Hopewell. First lived in Roxbury, Massachusetts, moved to Milford in 1639, and then he went back to England by 1654. So he was one of the more peripatetic immigrants that we have. Then the occupation, he was a husbandman. Church membership, he was into the Roxbury Church. His date of being a freeman. His education, like I said, it doesn't have like what school he went to or anything, but the fact that he signed his will and that they had Bibles indicates that he was at least literate, most likely. His offices, his estate. Let's go on to the next page here, and that's his biographical information. His children, associations, comments, bibliographic note. So that's one example. This John Astwood was unusual in that so much was known about him in terms of the ship he came on and everything, but we'll get to that later on. Okay, the sources used for each of these sketches are passenger lists. This is on the next slide here. Passenger lists, lists of freemen, things that you would expect. So, but the nice thing about these studies is that it has the benefit of being exhaustive. So Once completed, it will exhaustively cover all of the 1620 to 1640 immigrants to New England, and also for each of those, it exhaustively covers the main sources of information. So the intent was to have sort of a one-stop shop for the most up-to-date information about each person. Because before this was a thing, you had to check dozens, if not hundreds, of other sources to figure out what was known about each person. And when you have everyone doing the same thing, it just was not an efficient way to do it. So that was one of the impetuses for starting the project. All right, so moving on. The next is American Ancestors is not neglecting the period after 1640. However, with the early New England Family Studies Project, directed by Alicia Crane Williams, we cover New Englanders between 1640 and 1700. So the people that came over after 1640 as well, although not quite as numerous so far. There are 2 published volumes to date, and the entries from those volumes are in an online database on American Ancestors, together with new entries as they are put together. So the people who appear in these are the people who are in Tories, New England marriages index to 1700. This next slide there. As the sketches in the Great Migration Study Project are based on the people listed in the Great Migration Directory, in the New England Family Studies Project, they are based on those listed in Tories Index. And the sketches are grouped by year of marriage rather than by immigration. Eventually, all the marriages through 1700 are intended to be treated. The database contains 133 plus sketches so far. So on the next page here, we see an example of one of these sketches. This is for John Allen. As you can see, it's very similar in format to the sketches for the Great Migration Study Project. Same sort of categories, although of course they don't have where they lived in England, because this is after they came over for the most part. There are a few differences. The main difference that I see is a formatting one. It has footnotes instead of inline sources. And on the second page, as you can see, it goes as far as their children with a commentary at the end, just like in the Great Migration sketches. All right. In order to access those sketches, you go to the next slide here. You go to this address here, which is not complete. Should have the word research at the end of that after the dash, after England, to complete the entire web address. But that brings up this page here. You see the top of it. And if you want to search for somebody, you can either scroll down in the list of sketches there, which is listed by the main person of that sketch, either the main the head of household, either the man or the woman, usually the man in these cases, or you can search throughout the sketches by entering the search terms over here, which will search not only the name of the head of household, but also other names that would appear in those sketches. So that can be useful if the person that you're looking for is, say, like a son-in-law or a daughter, rather than the head of household himself. All right, so the last, I should say, until the early New England families database is complete, James Savage's genealogical dictionary of the first settlers of New England can still be useful. And that's the last thing we're looking at in this section here. This work was published in the early 1860s, when our society was still in its teenage years. And while it's been greatly superseded by more recent scholarship, in many instances, it can still be a useful work, especially for its coverage of families that haven't yet been otherwise treated in print. So in this particular instance, you can see it talks about Henry Douglas at the top here, and this is someone who came over after 1640. So he wouldn't be included in any of the Great Migration stuff. Eventually, he will be included in the early New England Families Project, but he's not there yet. All right. So moving on to compiled genealogies. Many thousands of book-length genealogies of New England families have been published over the past 200 years. far too many to include here, even in token form. The value of these books depends on a number of factors, such as the skill and honesty of the author. And by honesty, I have reference to a number of instances that have been discovered over the years of people, especially in the late 1800s, who would prey on the gullibility and money of their American clientele to find fictitious English ancestries, usually illustrious ancestries of the immigrants. So you have to be careful sometimes looking at some of these older genealogies that it wasn't published by one of those particular people. So anyway, this is the skill or honesty of the author, the sources consulted by the author, and the documentation of those sources. Those all contribute to the value of each of those works. Any planned research that you do should begin with a check to see if the family in question has already been treated in print. So in order to check for this, you want to start with those findings that we mentioned before. And just to know what is out there, it's also a good idea to check for the surname or surnames in question in the American Ancestors Library catalog online or the Family Search catalog online. They have a pretty good list of what has been published for New England families. Okay, so moving on to populations, that is people in particular places. Just a few examples. This is another type of published work that can be invaluable for researchers, which I refer to here as populations. And there are just a few examples of these. Okay, so the first of these examples is an early one. This is Charles Henry Pope's Pioneers in Massachusetts, 1620 to 1650, which was published back in 1900. Pope restricts his attention to people in Massachusetts instead of New England in general, allowing him to include a bit more biographical information than in Savage's work. So here, you see there's that Henry Douglas again. And it has a bit more detail about not just who he married and who his children were, but his will, some of those land ownership and so forth. So just a bit more information there. In a much later work, published in 2007, Ethel Farrington Smith restricted her attention to even further to the Massachusetts town of Hull. In several dozen genealogical sketches, she details several generations of early immigrants to this town, allowing for a more complete picture of the interconnectedness of those people. So this is a much smaller work, but also much more advanced in terms of scholarship. All right, the next one we're going to look at here is one of two by the great genealogical scholar Donald Lyons Jacobus. He was known in particular for his expertise with early Connecticut families, and one of his seminal works was his History and Genealogy of the Families of Old Fairfield, that is, the early families of Fairfield County, Connecticut. So if you have family in that area, especially in this time period, it's an invaluable source to check. As you can see on this page here, there isn't really any citations to sources. And this was the sort of the state of things back then, before were actually Jacobus himself and others, started insisting on more citation of sources. But you can kind of tell what the citations would be if you had them, just by the nature of the things indicated. All right, so this has been in several editions over the years. Another thing by Jacobus was his 8-volume Families of Ancient New Haven. So while this work stands alone, it was actually the first 8 volumes of his self-published journal called the New Haven Genealogical Magazine, which in its 9th volume became the American Genealogist. So that's a publication that has continued to this day. We'll talk a bit about it later. But when you look in the database for it on American Ancestors, you'll see that it begins with volume 9, and that's why. It's because the first 8 volumes were this history of the different families of ancient New Haven. All right, the last item we're going to look at here in this category is the Genealogical Dictionary of Maine and New Hampshire, which is written by Sybil Noyes, Charles Thornton Libby, and Walter Goodwin Davis from 1928 through 1939, originally published, and then republished since then. As you can see, it is similar in layout to Pope's work on Massachusetts families, though it has more details and goes a bit later into the late 1600s. One thing I like about this one is that just with the genealogical scholarship of the three authors here, they often had insights that you wouldn't normally see in works of this sort. So, for example, in the Sweat category here, before they start with Captain Benjamin Sweat, you can see, it says, if you can read that closely, it says Dorcas, Stephen, Joseph, Benjamin, children of John were baptized at which is looks like Wymondham, but it's probably pronounced Wyndham County, Norfolk, from 1618 to 1624. And so back when this was published, sometime in 1639 or earlier, he had already found the English origin of those folks, which in a much later article written by myself and Robert Charles Anderson and Randy West, we looked at that further and linking up that family to Robert Key's family also. But that insight has been there for the past, what's it now, 90 years or so. So anyway, if you had an ancestor in either of those colonies, Maine or New Hampshire, before 1700, you definitely need to check this book out. All right, so moving on to periodicals. Many periodicals include various types of articles of interest to researchers in colonial New England, such as extracted vital records, land records, and ship records. But most importantly, they have well-researched and documented genealogical articles representing sort of the state of the art for the various people and families covered at the time of publication. As a bonus, almost all such periodicals are usually indexed in the final volume of each year, and the issues that are online at American Ancestors are all searchable as a whole. So some examples that we have at American Ancestors are, we have the Register, of course, from 1847 to the present. We have the American Genealogist through 2016, the Genealogist through 2016, the Connecticut Nutmegger through 2017, the Essex Genealogist through 2017, the Maine Genealogist through 2019, the Mayflower Descendant in its whole run, though it has some gaps in publication, 1899 through the present, Rhode Island Roots through 2019, and Vermont Genealogy through 2017. The reason that is through those dates is that with all these various publications, we have agreements with the actual publishers of those to run everything except for like the last several years of the publication in order so they can keep their subscriptions up. So as each year goes on, we get that next year. All right. So if you want to search those on American Ancestors, you can either search them individually, or the way I prefer to do it is a search for a name with a general search, and then just narrow it down to one or more of those journals afterwards by clicking on the various tabs in the menu. All right, so finally, we're looking at primary documents. Normally, I would call these original documents instead of primary documents, but I had to come up with the P word to make my alliteration work. So technically, for the colonial period we are discussing, there is no such thing as a published original document, as all the original documents of the time and place were handwritten. However, there are a number of published resources that made searching primary documents much easier. These can include transcriptions and abstracts of original documents and indexes to those original documents. And also, with the modern advent of machine reading and AI, a sort of automated transcription from an image of an original document is possible. So moving on to the next slide here. This is kind of a short list of the types of things you can expect to find or hope to find for easier access to the original documents in published form. Almost all of the original or the earliest vital records for New England towns have appeared in print in one form or another, and most of those are accessible through American Ancestors Online. Of the rest, probate records are usually indexed, but just for the testators in the most part, and sometimes transcribed or abstracted. There are certain places in New England, especially in Massachusetts, that have long runs of abstracted or transcribed probate records, which are very useful. And I see that I forgot on this list to include land records, which are also usually indexed and in some cases transcribed or abstracted as well. Right. Notarial records, the very last item noted there, The two most useful such works are the works that were put together by Letchford and Aspinwall, both of which have been transcribed and indexed and are in print. You can avail, and available for purchase. Also, often you can find them online in various um, formats. Okay, so the last thing to look at here is the use of family searches, every word search or full text search. So this is what I was talking about for the advent of AI and machine reading. It makes many documents which have not been transcribed or indexed by humans in the past as if they had been, although very imperfectly. So this is not a substitute for using existing indexes to original records, but in cases where those indexes don't exist or are deficient, this can be a great help. So this is where you go to look for the familysearch.org/en/search/full text. When you go there, you can search here. I've searched for the term or for the phrase Adam Hawks, who's an early 1600s immigrant to Lynn, and so you can see the first three results that pop up here out of 1,175 returns without doing any limiting or filtering of my search. Okay, so obviously I'm not interested in things that are this late for the colonial period. So on the next slide here, I've filtered my search to include just things from the 1600s and just from Massachusetts. So you can limit your search in terms of place and location as well as type of documents. You can see the different filters that I've used on their collection and so forth. Okay, so with that limit, there are only 19 results. The top 4 of them are on here. And so it's nice because you can read what they have to say or what is in that particular document according to their machine reading, and where the highlighted text is what the search term was. And so if I click on that first one, I get this. So I don't know if you can read it on there. It's probably too small to read, but you can see the instances that at least where they think that the term Adam Hawks is all highlighted there. And there are various ways you can go about finding what the exact record this was actually in once you get that point. So the technology is far from perfect, and it will return false matches and miss real matches along with other issues. As I said earlier, it should not be used instead of available indexes, but rather in addition to those indexes. So for land records such as this one, most indexes only include the grantors and grantees. However, this search will include, although imperfectly, not just the grantors and grantees, but also witnesses, land bounds, and so forth. So it's especially useful for that, finding instances of the name or the search term you're looking for that would not be in the index. So hopefully, as the technology improves, original documents will become virtually the same as published ones in terms of accessibility and search capability. All right. I hope that this presentation has been helpful for those of you listening. We've only just scratched the surface of what is available out there, but this should be enough to whet your appetite and start you on your way. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Robert. That was a wonderful presentation. So many great resources shared there, just chock full of information. Before we kind of move along, I quickly just want to pull up one of your slides. I apologize, I kind of paused a little too briefly on this slide, and some folks asked for this link. So this is the full text search that Robert was just showing at the end here. So you can find the URL there, and it will also be in the recording that's available later today. Apologies for pausing a little too quick on that page. All right, so moving along here, because I know we've been getting some great questions coming in. First, I just wanted to quickly mention some upcoming events that you all may be interested in. So first up in May, we have an online course on researching colonial New England ancestors. Robert will be one of our presenters for this, along with many of our other staff genealogists as well. That'll be a 5-week course happening in May. And then we also have another free online lecture coming up on May 13th on English immigration to the American colonies. This will be presented by our senior genealogist, Rhonda R. McClure. And I also wanted to mention we do have a research tour. This should say it's an in-person research tour at the Connecticut State Library in Hartford. This will be taking place May 21st to the 23rd. Our genealogists Christopher C. Child and Jen Shack-Schober will be leading this research tour. I'll also be on the tour myself, running logistics. And if you do have any questions about that, you can reach out to me and I'd be happy to help. We also have a membership promotion happening at the moment where you can join for $25 off with the promo code APR25. If you're not a member yet, you can take advantage of that. All right, and now we'll get into your great questions that have been coming in. So first up, Robert, we have a question here. Someone asked, what are the best sources in which to find Old World origins in England for early New England colonists?
Okay. So the best place to start for that is the finding aids that we talked about before, which especially the Great Migration Directory, which is up to date as of about 2015. To check what has appeared since then, especially in periodicals, you probably want to check those indexes. Do a search online at American Ancestors for the periodicals to see if something new has popped up on any of those particular people. And if those origins include descents from royalty, which is not the most common thing, but does happen. However distantly, you want to check Gary Boyd Roberts's The Royal Descents of 900 Immigrants, now in its second edition, which is published in 2022, which is pretty up to date in terms of those origins which have been found, which include descents from earlier times. It can also be helpful to check what's been proposed or claimed online. I say this with some trepidation, but especially in places like Wikitree. So the Puritan Great Migration Project there has done a pretty good job of regulating what appears in that database for known immigrants and this time period, though they don't have control over all of the various things that people have put on there. So that it does have more control than say you would get over on Family Search's database. And of course, I'm not sure what the intention of the questioner was. This is assuming that you simply want to know what has been published. If you're planning doing your own searching for origins, that's something that I will be addressing later on in May.
All right, perfect. Thank you. And then we also got a question of where do we find the focus on section in the Great Migration newsletter?
Okay, so you can either just take it upon yourself to just look at each issue. It's always one of the usually on this second page, but it's always one of the things listed in the little index or table of contents for each one. But in the syllabus, I've gone through each of those and listed the various places listed in that alphabetically with the actual volume and page number for each.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then kind of similar question. Somebody asked, how broad is that focus on section? Does it cover, and also does it cover all of New England?
It does not. It only covers those things that Robert Charles Anderson took it upon himself to cover. So it wasn't intended to be exhaustive in that sense. However, for the earliest settlements, especially in Massachusetts and just to a lesser degree Connecticut, it is fairly exhaustive. Now, for each particular town covered, the amount of information is not the same. So for some places like Boston, there are actually like 3 or 4 different focuses or foci, if you will, that have been devoted to that city or that town, whereas some other ones may only have a page or so. And within each focus, some that can vary as well from a single page or even a single paragraph sometimes to several pages, as we had for Lynn.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then somebody asked, are there any resources about the families of lone passengers on the Mayflower?
Okay, so all of the Mayflower passengers, whether they're traveling as a family or by themselves, are covered in the Pilgrim Migration book, as well as a follow up to that, the Mayflower Migration that we talked about before. If anyone's looking online, an excellent online resource, which is unusual to say excellent and online in the same phrase, but there it is. An excellent online resource for New England for Mayflower families is Caleb Johnson's site, mayflowerhistory.com, Mayflower History, all one word.com. One of the items on that site is a list of the passengers on the Mayflower with links to what is known about each of them.
Okay, great. Thank you. Then we have a question here. I have the fifth edition of the Genealogist's Handbook for New England Research. Is it worthwhile to replace it with the newer edition?
Not having access to the fifth edition, I don't know what has changed. So I would assume that if the only thing that's different would be is the addresses, then it might not be quite as useful. But like I said, if there are any features that I love that aren't in the fifth edition, I don't know what they are, unfortunately.
Okay, great. Thank you. And then we have a question here. What indexes are available to publish genealogies?
All right, so most genealogies themselves, if they're decent, have their own index. But if you're looking for an outside index of those various genealogies, um, it's kind of difficult. You can find indexes that include like the main person in that genealogy, like the forebear that came over, perhaps, using the findings that we've already talked about. The closest thing probably to an every name index in the books published at least until 1962 would be Torrey's index, but they would only be included if the person in question had married somebody before 1699. But it's a lot more thorough than say just knowing the name of the head of the family. Um, Also, if you go online using the Internet Archive or HathiTrust, you can perform searches for particular names. And so sometimes that will return a good match in whatever published genealogies appear in those databases. Um, so if you want the link for the Internet Archive search, it's just archive.org/search. And then under that search, you'll want to be sure to click the search text contents in order to actually search within the book itself and not the metadata about the book.
All right, great. Thank you very much. And then another question here. What resources are available that can help determine what ship brought an ancestor to New England?
All right. So I'm sounding like a bit of a broken record here, but uh, we don't have passenger lists for most of the ships that carry New England colonists. So the chances of finding out which ship brought a particular colonist over is pretty slim. However, if the name of the ship is known, then the best place to look is the Great Migration Directory, first of all, because that's one of the things that they do list there if it's known. If they came over after that, you're a little bit more out of luck. But another place you can look is a work commonly called Houghton's List, or simply Houghton, which is a book written by John Camden Houghton, the original list of persons of quality, published in 1874. And you can find this all over the internet. But it's useful as a list of a lot of different known passenger lists and who was on them, although it's not perfect. Let's see. Yeah, like I said, for most people, the best we can do is determine when they most likely, just when they most likely came over and not on what ship or the name of the ship.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think we have time for just a couple more questions here. So another one, do you know if there's any plan to publish errata, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, or corrections to Anderson's Great Migration series?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, like I said, the first series through 1633 is is being gradually superseded, and so errata and those would be addressed either directly or indirectly by the updated sketches. Um, and there are some also corrections to earlier work going on in terms of when people came over. So in a few cases, people who came over earlier were inadvertently left out of that series, and so they're putting them into the subsequent series. So that happened, for example, in most recent volume of the Great Migration directory or Great Migration that came out, which is that first volume of the third series. And pull this off the shelf here. Yeah, at the end of this, they have. Let's see, I can't find it right now. But anyway, they have about 6 or 7 sketches of people who should have been included in a previous series but hadn't. So they're putting them there. So that's one form of errata that's appearing. In terms of other stuff, there really isn't that I'm aware of something planned for publication, although sometimes corrections are published in the register, although that's usually in the form of an article that addresses it rather than just like a name or a date that was misplaced.
All right, thank you. And then we had received a question asking if the books mentioned in today's presentation are available online at American Ancestors. So I did mention to that person that they are available in our bookstore, but I think we had some other questions about if they're kind of digitized in our databases. So off the top of your head, of the books mentioned today, are any of those kind of digitally available to members on our website?
Most of the ones that have been published by us in the past, say 20 years, are not. However, some of them are. So, for example, the 2 volumes of Alicia Williams's early New England families, those are all available online in the sketches. Um, and if you go back to, excuse me, uh, go back to that page that says published volumes for the Great Migration Study Project, those 3 things that have stars next to them are all available online. So the first series, The Great Migration Begins, all 3 volumes are available online. Yeah, there it is. The second series, The Great Migration through 1635, those 7 volumes are all available online. And the Great Migration newsletter is available online. I think the plan for the subsequent series is that as the books are coming out, they probably won't be available online, but at some point, probably once the series is complete, that will also become available, but that probably won't be for several years in the future.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much again, Robert, for this great presentation. So many uh, great resources shared there, and thank you for answering questions as well. Unfortunately, that is just about all we have time for today. I know we've had some great questions coming in. So I do want to mention we do have a great chat service available, which is totally free and open to the public. And it puts you in direct communication with a genealogist, and it's available to the public Monday through Saturday from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. So I definitely recommend that. You can ask any of your questions that we didn't get to today there. And again, that's available at americanancestors.org/chat. And if you do have more specific questions about your family history research, you might consider hiring our research services team. We also offer consultations as well that allow you to speak one-on-one with a genealogist. You can book that through the link shown on the screen or through the QR code displayed there as well. So thank you all again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback on today's webinar. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. This free webinar was made possible by the generous support of our members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American ancestors to help keep these programs free and to create more free programs as well. If you'd like to access more how-to resources or learn about upcoming online educational programs, please visit our online learning center at americanancestors.org/education. I wish you the best of luck in your research, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.